If there's something we love in Star Trek, it's a good old resurrection, be it a ship or a character. But I mean, we also really love when the ships get resurrected. So with that, we're going to go through 10 of the characters we feel are absolutely worthy of a resurrection today. One person who may need a resurrection is our wonderful editor Tom, who has to take what I send him and turn it into visual gold. Love you, Tom. I'm Sean Ferrick for Trek Culture, and here are 10 characters worthy of a resurrection. Number 10, Cal Hudson. Calvin Hudson, played by the late Bernie Casey, was a fascinating character introduced in Deep Space Nine's The Maquis. He was like Ben Sisko in many ways. Both had graduated from the academy together, both had been mentored by Curzon Dax, and both had lost their wives. Hudson's assignment to the demilitarized zone exposed him to the abuse the colonists received at the hands of the Cardassians, convincing him to join the Maquis. Michael Piller actually saved Hudson from dying. As the script was being worked out, Ira Stephen Bear originally concluded the episodes with Hudson's death, but this was vetoed, not least on the strength of Casey's performance. When interviewed at the time about his involvement, Casey was enthusiastic about the role, even suggesting he would be delighted to appear on Star Trek Voyager in some capacity. Instead, Hudson was given an ignoble, off-screen death, dying in a skirmish with Cardassians. This has never felt like a fitting end for a character who, there but for the grace of the station, could well have been our hero character throughout. Hudson's return, exactly as he was at the time of his death, would also serve to reintroduce the Maquis to Star Trek, so to have the viewpoint on the admittedly darker Federation of the future would be quite a mirror to hold up to it. Number 9, Hemmer. Bruce Horak's Hemmer, the Enar engineer on Strange New Worlds, was introduced in the closing moments of the pilot episode. He would appear sporadically through the season until his very Geiger-esque exit in Memento Mori. Although his journey ended as an egg sac for some baby Gorn, his story was never simply about the destination. Horak is 91% blind in his left eye and his right eye is artificial. This is due to a cancer, bilateral retinoblastoma, that he suffered as a child. Hemmer is depicted as totally blind, with CGI turning his eyes completely white, though his telepathy allows him to navigate the sighted world. Hemmer is a fascinating character, not least to explore how an officer with a disability operates on a starship, but also the fact he's an Enar. This subsect of Andorians was introduced late in Star Trek Enterprise's run and remains largely unexplored. Hemmer's sudden death felt jarring, cut down without much fanfare, so finding a way to bring this character back would not only continue the story of Hemmer, but also the understanding of the Enar and then their relationship with death. We actually have a little more hope here, as it's been confirmed that Bruce Horak's Star Trek journey is not yet complete. Number 8, Gabriel Lorca. Let's make things clear right now. Mirror Lorca's fall into that wonderful ball of dissolving energy is a special memory from Star Trek Discovery's first season, and we wouldn't wish to rob anyone of that. Jason Isaacs can do it all. He can sneer, he can smirk, and he can die in the most satisfying ways. No, it isn't Mirror Lorca that this article entry is about. Captain Gabriel Lorca of the USS Buran was flung into the Mirror Universe, never to be seen again. That strikes us as distinctly unfair, for a number of reasons. Perhaps first and foremost is that everyone who describes Lorca describes him as a decorated captain and a good man. Having him simply tossed into the Mirror Universe, presumed dead and forgotten about, well, that doesn't seem very Starfleet, does it? With one season left to go in Discovery's run, the clock may have run out for Lorca there, but Michelle Yeoh's Section 31 long trek may be the perfect time to resurrect the character. Perhaps he could be saved from the brutal Terran Empire, or his trip there could have been prevented in the first place. However they manage it, Prime Lorca deserves better. Number 7, Captain Rachel Garrett. Yesterday's Enterprise is a stunning piece of television, with nearly every single note hitting perfectly. In fact, other than Geordie's cuffs, the only thing that really stands out is the sudden death of Captain Rachel Garrett's potential. Trisha O'Neill imbued the character with a strength that lasted the test of time, proven only recently in the pilot of Star Trek Picard's third season, The Next Generation. A statue of her stands outside a Starfleet recruitment center, only to be almost immediately destroyed. Are we sensing a theme here? Perhaps including Captain Garrett here may be a stretch, as we would be just as happy with a series or long trek exploring the story of the Enterprise C before its fateful encounter with the Romulans. It has always felt like a story waiting to be told, with, chronologically at least, the first woman in the captain's chair of an Enterprise. There is a wealth of possibility there. Who is Garrett? What was Starfleet Academy like for her? The Enterprise C was the flagship, so how did her career lead her to the center seat? We would also be more than happy with a story picking up after the Enterprise C goes back through the wormhole, with Garrett somehow coming back to life, watching her experience that survivor's guilt, with perhaps efforts to change historical events, may have shades of Admiral Janeway, and we are so here for it. Number 6, Gary Mitchell. Now, this one may seem a little left field, but does anyone agree that the defeat of the superhuman Gary Mitchell was all a bit easy? Having come into contact with the galactic barrier, it was simpler times back in the 60s when a ship could just nip across the quadrant and be home in time for tea. Gary Mitchell and Elizabeth Daner, both of whom scored quite highly in ESP, of course, begin to develop godlike powers. Had they been allowed to develop, this could very well have been an origin story for the Q. Instead, Kirk drops a rock on Mitchell and Daner is electrocuted by the newly mad version of Gary, and then everyone just goes about their day. Two godlike beings brought down easier than a Gorn. Okie dokie then. The return of Mitchell, the malevolent of the two, would make for a very interesting, extremely dangerous foe in Star Trek. Have we ever stopped to think, what would happen if Q really did decide to go off the rails one day? Perhaps Mitchell's powers wouldn't be that extensive, but if I were a Starfleet captain, I wouldn't like to be the one facing off against him. Which, to this potentially sociopathic writer, is exactly why the return of Gary Mitchell could be a cautionary tale about skirting with the Galactic Skirting Board to frighten young cadets for decades to come. Number 5, Weyoun. Yeah, last clone, I know. But how easy would it be to simply find a file saved to a hard drive somewhere on Cardassia with Weyoun 10 stored and ready to go? Then, feed him into one of those lovely Dominion cloning machines and hey presto, you get a rather annoyed Vorta ready to continue the war. And then he learns that his gods have been tortured at the hands of Section 31 and are systematically being rounded up by Admiral Crusher's new detection software, and that his own murderer is now living back on Cardassia free from exile at last. If there was anyone who could pull this off, it's Jeffrey Combs. He manages to walk that line between disarmingly charming and pure evil, better than most. So how could this mouthpiece of the Dominion survive in the new hyper-vigilant era of Starfleet? Is there a place for Vorta on the alpha side of the wormhole? Might he have some scores to settle with a certain former tailor? These are the questions that need answering, and we promise it's not just because we do anything to have Combs back in Star Trek, though that may of course be a part of it. Number 4, Tasha Yar. This is a name that often comes up on lists like Wasted Potential or Unfinished Stories. There's a reason. Tasha's story is certainly unfinished and full of wasted potential. Yesterday's Enterprise gave the audience a wonderful send-off for a version of Tasha, and the introduction of Sela gave us the eventual fate of that character. But Denise Crosby's first iteration of Tasha was simply tossed aside by an oil slick, hoping to shock the audience and instead sending her out on a sour note. What's worse, much of her legacy is tainted with the idea that one of her biggest contributions to Star Trek history was being the woman to take Data's virginity. Hardly a legacy deserving of such an integral character in the Next Generation's first season. Although we can't pretend that Skin of Evil didn't happen, as it's given us great stories like Yesterday's Enterprise, Redemption, Unification, and a hilarious joke in The Spy Humongous, that doesn't mean that Tasha's story should end there. There really is so much more to do with her. We've never seen her with Ishara Yar, for example. What would that reunion look like, especially knowing Ishara betrayed her friends? Tasha deserved better, and it's about time that was set to rights. Number 3, Trip. Technically, Charles Tucker III doesn't belong on this list, as his death occurred in a holodeck fantasy that Riker was running and therefore didn't happen in reality, right? Right? No. Until stated otherwise, these are the voyages must be treated as canon, which means Trip needs to be resurrected. Handily enough, a version of this has already happened in beta canon, with the novels revealing him to have survived and is now working for Section 31. While this writer feels that Section 31 has been done to death, when it comes to the return of Trip, we'll take what we can get. He was the chief engineer aboard the first Warp 5 starship, and his death was included for shock purposes only. It was also set 10 years after the previous episode, so that does leave a decade of untold stories. But Star Trek Picard has recently offered another possible story thread. The NX-01 was present at the Fleet Museum, though in its refit form, with the added secondary hull. Tucker, of all people, should be the man leading that refit, back in the 22nd century. Having such a major overhaul of the Enterprise without him just feels wrong. Whether he is brought back for a short trek depicting the refit, human or as a hologram, or perhaps for a longer in an ongoing format, if there is one thing that Trekkies can unite on, it's that Charles was done dirty, and that needs to be fixed. Number 2, Jadzia. For this entry, we'd like to suggest something a little out of the box. What would it look like to bring Jadzia back to life? A Jadzia that is the same one we saw die at Ducat's Pa-Wraith-possessed hands, but without the Dax symbiont, which has already passed on to Ezri. So it would be Jadzia returning to life, but not Jadzia Dax. This affords a look into what life is like for a Trill after separation from a symbiont. We've seen events in Star Trek that have led to the death of the host, but the idea of losing that other other consciousness and living with it, what would that feel like? So on the one hand, as an audience, we would be delighted to see Jadzia return, think of that reunion with Worf and the exploration of what's happened in the past 30 years of history. Then, would this Jadzia have any interest in meeting Ezri Dax, or vice versa? Would it be too difficult for Ezri to look into her former host's eyes, knowing they both share the memories of her death? There was so much handled incorrectly about the way Jadzia Dax was written out of Deep Space Nine that a resurrection could very well be the reckoning that Terry Farrell fans have sought for years. Number 1. Captain Liam Shaw. Episode 1. Who's this prick? Episode 9. If Shaw dies, we riot. Todd Stashwick's Liam Shaw was such an unexpectedly endearing character in this season of Star Trek Picard. Although the smart money said he'd be punching his clock at some point, few expected just how hard it would hit watching him hand over the reins to Captain 7 of 9. Should Star Trek Legacy get the green light that many of us hope it will, the return of Shaw seems a prerequisite. Now, we're open to being flexible here. If Captain Shaw must stay dead and buried, then we would quite happily accept emergency engineering hologram Shaw, a grease monkey ready to keep the Enterprise G flying, despite the numerous scrapes and scuffles its new captain may hot drop it into. Terry Matalas has already said that if the show goes ahead, there is already a plan in place to bring the dipshit from Chicago back to us, though of course he's keeping tight-lipped on the how of it all. Honestly, we'd just love to see another confrontation, one where he finds out that Locutus's son was the catalyst for the Borg's latest attempt on the Federation. We're sure that conversation will go well. Now that's everything for our list today. However, this is one of those ones where we could just keep adding names. So who would you like to see resurrected? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to check us out over on Twitter at Trek Culture and on Instagram at Trek Culture YT. Thank you again to the wonderful Tom. You can catch him over on Twitter at Tom C. Finn. And of course you can catch me at Sean Ferrick on Twitter as well. Until I see you again, make sure that you live long and prosper, look after yourselves, be kind, lead with kindness, and look after those nearest and dearest to you. You're all wonderful. Have a great week. Make it so.